Hmm.
Then my sons, at that time had to make a lot of lies, For instance, oh, British, young men, they are very poor. They are very, they do not have enough food, so they are very hungry. My sons asked, Daddy, it's very difficult to create a kind of, lies to my friends about London. What can I do? So at that time I said, oh, then you should.
Mr. Tay, I mean, you just to give a context, like you had everything right in Pyongyang, and
Yes, that's right.
you had a very good job, you had a very good career. The regime trusted you, and Kim Jong Un trusted you, and all those kind
Yes.
of things. Like, I'm just wondering, like, what ultimately led your defection? Because like a lot of people, for many different people, like I personally, when I was in North Korea, I was hungry, and I've already experienced the freedom when I was in China when I first escaped North Korea. So I cannot forget about the freedom that I had, and on top of that, I was really hungry. So that led me to my defection back in 2011. But for you, I'm just really curious to know, like, what ultimately led you to this is it, like I can't do this anymore, like I want to go.
Yes, right. Actually, my life in North Korea is quite different from yours in North Korea because uh, I did not defect, from North Korea because of hunger or starvation or for economic reasons, because I led a very privileged life in North Korea. Even though I was not as rich as your life, at that time, actually, I ended nothing, Yes, but when I was posted to European capitals, I started to doubt the North Korean, yes, system. As you know, when I was in North Korea, we were taught and brainwashed that North Korea is a socialist paradise, right? But when I went to Europe, uh, before I went to Europe, I thought that European countries are capitalist countries, so the streets would be, full of beggars. Their contradictions between capitalists and workers would be extreme. The If you want to get a medical, the treatment, you need money or whatever, something like that. But when I was first posted to Denmark, I couldn't believe my eyes that the streets were very clean. The
Mm,
children go to public school without paying anything because of the nationwide medical insurance system. The people can get medical care, the free of charge. So I thought that North Korea is not the paradise, but Denmark is the paradise, you see, if I compared.
mm,
Yes. And
mm,
then, so I started to doubt about all those educations I received during my life in North Korea. And second
mm,
thing is that I started doubt, the system is that, North Korea, continue to develop its nuclear weapons, missiles, of all those things, while starving its people.
mhm,
Yes. The normal people in North Korea do not get enough food.
mhm,
They are starved by the system, but
mhm,
the regime is pouring, millions of dollars in developing nuclear weapons and ICBMs. And
mhm,
in late of 1990s, tens of thousands of people starved to death.
mhm,
So I think the state and the government is not in place for the life of the people. So I started doubt of the system, but that
mm,
kind of, the doubt actually did not push me to defect North Korea, because
mm.
North Korea is a system of guilt by association. So
Right,
if you defect North
crime
Korea,
privilege.
then
Mhm,
your brothers and sisters in laws, your parents, would be punished. And even though I was born from poor class, But if I defect, then the rest of my relatives and my brother and sisters' status would, downgrade from core class to hostile
Uh,
class.
yeah.
So that's why I cannot sacrifice, you know, the destiny of my sister and brother, my relatives, for the sake of my freedom. So I waited for the collapse of North Korean system, but that did not happen. But on the meanwhile, my sons were growing. You know, I have two sons,
Hmm.
and since they were the children of North Korean diplomats, they actually, moved from Pyongyang to European capitals like Copenhagen, Stockholm, and London every 3 or 4 years.
Mm.
So their basic, the education was half and half. One part of the education was North Koreans brainwashing education, but the other half is, the British, a
Oh,
free and very democratic education. So
right.
in their minds, these two, the educations were always fighting and contradicting each other.
Right.
Yes. So when my sons were in London, then my son's friends, were very curious about the life in Pyongyang.
Mm.
So they started to ask questions to my sons like,
When people think about North Korea, they usually think of nuclear warheads, authoritarianism, and a heartless dictator. I'm making content because I want everybody to think of North Korean people. They are ordinary people who don't know how much better life could be. If you want to help me be a voice for voiceless North Koreans, I would love for you to support me on Patreon, where you can get early access to full-length videos, all sorts of fun pictures, outtakes, and other exclusive videos. Thank you, and I hope to see you there.
they started to ask questions to my sons like, hi, there is no internet in North Korea. What was North Korean young man doing without internet? These questions,
Yeah.
and if there is no Facebook, YouTube, or if there is no internet, then how can North Korean children play games, internet games like this? And they ask why North Korean children are forced to have a short haircut, So
Mhm.
they always ask these questions to my sons, which put my sons in a very difficult, the situations. And
Uncomfortable too, right?
that's very uncomfortable. And when my sons are back to Pyongyang, their North Korean friends started to ask a lot of questions about their lives in London. What about, the British boys, what kind of games they are playing? How, Britain is very famous. It's Premier,
Right,
the football,
right.
what is the level
Mhm.
of their football? All those questions. But in North Korea, if you say anything favorable to capitalism, then you would be arrested. So
Right. Mhm.
then my sons, at that time had to make a lot of lies, for instance, oh, British, young men, they are young people, students, they are very poor. They are very, they do not have enough food, so they are very hungry.
Oh,
London streets are filled with beggars, something like all
oh,
those
oh.
lies.
Mhm, mhm.
Yes, otherwise,
You
it
get
would be
punished.
very difficult. So
Yeah.
my sons asked, Daddy, you know, it's very difficult to create a kind of, lies to my friends about London. What can I do? So
Mm,
at that time I said, oh, then you should read the novels of Charles Dickens, like Oliver
mm,
Twist or whatever, so that, you know, the novels written by Charles Dickens were the stories about those miserable lives in 18th or 19th century of London. So if you read these stories, then you can continue to tell that as if the current London life is similar with the rest of 17th or 18th or 19th
hundred.
century. You, but there's no way. But you have to, make a lie.
Mm,
So my
right.
son's life in Pyongyang were very difficult, but also their life in London were very difficult. So I thought, myself quite a long time because, I learned about democracy and free world when I was in later 30s. But my sons were different. They learned everything, when they were young. So I think that as a human being, if you know that there is a free, bright world, if you're out of a well like North Korea, then your
Hmm.
life your in North Korea could be very miserable if you know yourselves what kind of human being you are. So my sons and we continue to say that our life in North Korea or even in London was nothing, you know, but it's a kind of slavery. Yes, North
I
Korea's
agree.
system is a slave system. Why? Because there's no freedom to move around. The
Nope.
people do not travel, or go to foreign countries, And in North Korea, you cannot speak out whatever you think. In North Korea, you cannot read a book or film which you want to. So, if we compared the slavery system of America and the current system of North Korea, I think the slaves in America that in those old times were much better than the
Mm,
current North Korean lives. Why? Because at that time in America, even slaves were allowed to pray and worship,
yes.
right? But in
Hmm.
North Korea, people are not even allowed to pray or worship something. Yes.
Only the
So
regime.
that is how, so that's why, it took me quite a long time to arrive a final decision. I thought quite a long time what I should do for my children. I have to scale uh,
Hmm.
the destiny of my sister and brother and my relatives, and also the future of my children. And I
Mm,
thought that, you know, nothing is more important and precious than the future of my sons. And as a father, I think the legacy I can give to my sons is not, the money or property or whatever, but it must be the freedom. So I
mm,
decided to cut, the chain of slavery for my son and myself at my, the generation. So
mm.
that is how, yes, we finally decided to defect to
Hmm.
South Korea.